common claim I sometimes hear is that all the religions of the world are essentially the same. How might we respond to that suggestion? Well, imagine a friend were to come to you and say, hey, I've been busy reading of late, and in fact I've read every book in every library in the entire world, and I have come to the conclusion that every book by every author in every genre is telling exactly the same story. Every book is the same. What would you say to your friend? I think you would immediately conclude that your friend has gone balmy, that they can't possibly have read all of the books, because if they did so, they would obviously discover the books are different. Well, the same goes for religion. When somebody says to me they believe that all the religions in the world are essentially the same, my instant conclusion is they haven't studied any of them carefully. Because when you do so, when you investigate the different religions of the world, you discover they are claiming wildly different things. Let me give you just one example. For the last 20 years or so, I've been studying Islam. In fact, I got a PhD in Quranic studies, largely because I wanted to understand the faith of my Muslim friends better. But the more I studied Islam, the more I began to discover that Islam teaches not just something slightly different to Christianity, it teaches something profoundly different to Christianity. In fact, on every major teaching of the Christian faith, Islam teaches virtually the opposite. Let me give you just one simple example. At the heart of the Christian faith lies the claim that sometime round about AD 30, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified on a Roman cross. Or the Quran in chapter 4, verse 157, flat out denies that any such crucifixion took place. Thus we have a problem. The Gospels, the Christian Bible, teaches that Jesus was crucified. The Quran denies that he was crucified. Well, either he was or he wasn't. You can't reconcile, you can't harmonize those two claims, and thus you're forced to a conclusion. Either Christianity is true, or Islam is true, or they're both false. But the one thing they cannot both be is true, because they contradict one another.
Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. My name is Sophia, I'm your host. The aim of Let the Quran Speak is to help you gain deeper insights into Muslims and Islam, as it is practiced here and in other parts of the world. In this episode, the crucifixion of Jesus. Easter commemorates the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection from the dead. But what do Muslims believe happened to Jesus? Was he crucified? Will he return before the end of time? With me to discuss this topic is Dr. Shabir Ali, President of the Islamic Information Center. Dr. Shabir, it seems like Muslims have a very unorthodox understanding of what happened to Jesus.
Well, at least a very different understanding, somewhat different, we can say. Mm-hmm. There is an intersection of ideas at certain points, and then a diversion also.
Mm-hmm. It hinges on a particular verse in the Quran, right?
Yes. In fact, there are a few verses that touch upon this issue. There's a verse in Surah Al Imran, the 3rd chapter of the Quran, where it says that God said to Jesus, "Inni mutawaffika wa rafi'uka ilay." I'm going to, now I can't venture a translation without some interpretation here, but I'll do so anyhow. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take you and raise you to myself.
Okay.
Now, the verb that I've translated here as take might also mean I'm going to cause you to die. So there is some ambiguity here.
So take your life or something.
Yes,
like
whether some of the commentators said that this means that God is going to take Jesus in sleep. So his soul taken while he's asleep, or maybe his body and soul taken while he's in a state of sleep. Some others said no, God caused him to die for a few hours. Some said 3 hours, some said 7 hours, some said even 3 days, which almost parallels the gospel accounts, as if Jesus had been dead for a few days and then God somehow raised him to himself. Another passage in the same vein is in the 5th chapter of the Quran, where it says that Jesus will address God saying, فَلَمَّا تَوَفَّيْتَنِي كُنْتَ أَنْتَ الرَّقِيبَ عَلَيْهِمْ. After you had taken me, you remained as the watcher over my disciples. You, God, remained to watch over my disciples. So here is the idea that God took Jesus. But then what is meant by take? Again, the same sort of discussion follows, that it could be take in sleep or take in death. The verse, though, that you might be thinking of when you said that there is a verse is the one in Surah An-Nisa, the 4th chapter of the Quran, where it says that they said we killed Jesus, the Messiah, the messenger of God. And then the Quran follows up by saying, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ, whereas they killed him not, nor did they crucify him, but so it was made to appear to them.
This is a common verse that many Muslims quote.
Yes, and based on this verse, Muslims will commonly say that Jesus was not crucified, and by that they would mean that Jesus was not even put on the cross. So what are we to make of this whole gospel account that somebody was there on the cross and crucified under Roman authority, and that person was Jesus? Well, the Muslim commentators on the Quran generally say, with reference to this verse, that what actually happened was that Jesus was taken up alive into heaven before he was even arrested. And that's generally how the story is told. And someone else was made to look like Jesus, and this someone else was put on the cross.
Okay.
And so everyone was convinced that Jesus was on the cross, whereas in fact by this time Jesus was in heaven.
So who holds this point of view?
This is generally held by Muslims at large, because it is described like this in the Muslim commentaries on the Quran. However, that commentary on this verse is a spin-off from an attempt to take the verse in its most literal sense possible. You see, when it's crucifixion, both in English and in Arabic, is slightly ambiguous in that it can be used in two senses. One sense is that a person is actually executed by the method of crucifixion, which means he's actually put to death. But crucifixion can also mean merely hanging a person on the cross. Obviously with the intention of executing him, but not necessarily following through with it to the end.
But in most cases, wouldn't that be the natural sort of progression, that someone would die?
Yes,
Okay.
that would normally be the situation. But let's say it's discussed in Islamic texts what might be done with a certain category of criminals. And then the discussion follows, what if the person is put on the cross and then taken down after a while? Well, if he's put on the cross and taken down after a while, well, then he was still, in a sense, crucified. But in another sense, he wasn't crucified. So when the Quran is denying the crucifixion of Jesus, is it denying that Jesus was ever put on the cross at all? Or is it denying that Jesus was killed by this method? And to me, the most natural reading of the Quran in the light of what we know from the Gospels is that the Quran is denying that Jesus actually died on the cross. Now, if one were to study the Gospels carefully, one will see that there are points at which it is presumed that Jesus died, but no one had actually checked to see whether he died in the way in which one might expect a medical examiner to check. For example, listening for a heartbeat or checking the pulse of the person, even given the standards at the time. You see, Jesus was placed on a cross, which is by definition would place the victim above ground. So that in depictions of this in the Passion of the Christ, for example, you have Mary approaching Jesus, and Jesus is all the way up there, so that Mary's mouth is at the level with Jesus's toes. So what that means is that if you have a victim on the cross and he's several feet above ground, then if he appears to breathe his last, you cannot tell the difference between whether he is in a state of death or in a state of coma, for example. So when the reporters said that Jesus died, they just simply mean that, for all we can tell, he's expired and that's the end of him. And of course, if you take that crucified victim down from the cross and you put him in a grave and cover him with 6 feet of earth, then he will die.
So based on this understanding, then what do you think happened to Jesus then?
Well,
if we follow your line of logic?
One cannot say for absolutely sure what happened to Jesus, because this is a historical question. But as a theological matter, trying to interpret the Quran, I would say that when the Quran says that they did not crucify Jesus, it simply means that they did not succeed in their plan of killing Jesus by this method of execution. They thought they had finished the job, but in fact they had not. And so when the Gospel of Luke reports that the scholars who wanted to see Jesus dead, they left to observe the Sabbath towards the Friday evening when Jesus was crucified. And then Matthew's Gospel says that on the Saturday, they came to Pilate's court asking Pilate to seal up the tomb in which Jesus' body was placed, because they were afraid that his disciples will come and steal his body and then tell everyone that he was resurrected from the dead. And so it is said now that Pilate did give the order to have the tomb sealed. But when the soldiers went to seal the tomb, it is not mentioned that they actually looked inside to see if the body was still there. And so there is some ambiguity and some questions which are left unanswered by the sequence of events. The Gospels do narrate that on the Sunday, Jesus began to appear alive to his disciples. But Raymond Brown, in his introduction to New Testament Christology, has shown that all of these are various accounts which are found in the multiple Gospels, but depicting a central event. And that central event in which Jesus appeared to his disciples need not have been a physical flesh and blood appearance. It could have been a spiritual type of appearance. And this coincides with something that is mentioned in Tafsir al-Jalalain, that God had actually granted the disciples of Jesus a vision of Jesus, so that they could be satisfied that despite everything that they had observed, Jesus is in the end alive with God. And that would have been a source of solace and comfort to them.
Well, if it's true that the different religions of the world then are vastly different, how do we navigate the maze? There are so many different religions out there making so many different claims. Well, guess what? It means we need to do some thinking. We need to do some reading. We need to wrestle with some of the big questions of life, and we need to put the different religions to the test. I'd suggest that perhaps you begin with Christianity, for which the evidence is greater, I believe, than any other religion. How might you put Christianity to the test? Well, read the Gospels, look at the claims of Jesus, and see whether they stand up.
But one might ask, well, having already the New Testament documents, why do we need a book like the Quran? Well, look at the New Testament documents. The earliest of the four Gospels is the Gospel according to Mark, followed by Matthew and Luke, and then finally John. John contradicts the other three Gospels, which are called synoptics because they're often together in contrast with John, on very important points. For example, was the body of Jesus wrapped in spices or not? John says yes. The other Gospels show no, because the women were still buying spices on the Saturday and they went on the Sunday morning to anoint the body of Jesus. So this is a major discrepancy. Because whereas in fact the synoptic Gospels were trying to show that the women knew how Jesus was buried, this fact alone shows in fact they didn't really know if John is correct or is John wrong. When was Jesus actually crucified? According to the Gospel of John, he was crucified on what we would refer to as 14th Nisan, because according to John, that was the day before the eating of the Passover meal. According to the Synoptic Gospels, it was the following day. And since Jesus didn't die twice, then obviously either John is right or the Synoptics are correct. What about the Synoptics? Do they always agree with each other? In fact, when one compares the Gospels one after another, one will see that the same event in the life of Jesus or concerning his death is rewritten in the subsequent Gospels. Mark first, followed by Matthew and Luke. Look what Matthew does to Mark's Gospel. Mark has it that the women were coming to the tomb on the Sunday morning and they were wondering, who's going to roll away the stone for us? Matthew's Gospel has it that when... to continue with Mark for a moment, so they arrive there and they find that the stone had already been rolled. So there's no problem, nobody has to roll the stone, right? over to Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's Gospel has it that as the women were approaching, angels came down from heaven and rolled away the stone. So the way it is told in Matthew's Gospel, it is clear to many biblical commentators that Matthew deliberately reworded the event to have it such that the women would witness the rolling away of the stone. Because if the stone was rolled previously, one might wonder who rolled the stone and who took away the body. But if the women can see that the stone is being rolled in their very presence, well then the question is answered. Nobody rolled away the stone but the angels. Nobody took away his body. He actually came out alive from the tomb. So you see, the later Gospels are rewriting the story in order to cover up problems and difficulties with the event. Were there guards at the tomb? Matthew's Gospel is the only one that says that there were guards at the tomb. And today, almost universally, critical biblical scholars reject that as an invention on the part of Matthew. Even if you say it was not an invention, the story fails to do what it was meant to do. It was meant to tell us that the guards were there so nobody could have taken away the body. But the guards were, according to the story, placed there on the Saturday. What happened on the Friday night? Now, you might think, well, the guards must have checked to see that the body was there, but the story doesn't mention that. You can assume that, but assumption is not the same as fact. The body could have been removed on the Friday night. This is a real possibility, and this has been acknowledged by Dr. William Lane Craig in his article on the guard at the tomb, even though he accepts that there is a guard and he tries to prove that there is a guard. And of course, he believes that Jesus rose from the dead. He doesn't believe that anybody took the body, but he acknowledges that this is a real possibility. The tomb was unguarded on the Friday night, and the story doesn't say that they checked to see that the body was still there when they placed the guard and sealed the stone the following day. Did Jesus actually die on the cross? Well, the Gospel according to John says that a spear thrust was put in his side, and one might think that that surely killed him. But historians generally believe today that that spear thrust is not historical. John has introduced that into the story. It is not mentioned in the synoptics, and John has introduced that for his own theological reasons. Partly, some say, to make sure that everyone would know that Jesus actually died because he was speared in the side. Well, take away the spear thrust, which is not historical. What is the fact then about the story? What actually killed Jesus? There's nothing. Crucifixion doesn't actually kill a person by itself. What kills the person is exhaustion and shock that results from a prolonged hanging on the cross, sometimes for a couple of days. But according to the Gospel record, Jesus was there only for a few hours. This is why when Joseph of Arimathea requested his body for a private burial, Pilate, under whose auspices Jesus was said to have been crucified, wondered if Jesus could have died so soon. He inquired of the centurion, who confirmed, but the centurion was by this time a Christian and had no reason to want to see Jesus dead. So in short, even though the Quran comes 600 years later, to Muslims this is the word of God telling us the truth. Ma qataluhu wa ma salabuhu walakin shubbiha lahum. They killed him not, nor crucified him, though it did appear to them as if they had done so. Thank you.